In the final years of the 19th century, New Orleans was a city caught between two worlds. On one side, it was a place of music, lantern-lit streets, and the scent of magnolia drifting through the night air. On the other, it was a city heavy with secrets, shadows, and a quiet unease that never truly left its people. This uneasy balance made the perfect stage for a story that would puzzle generations. A story that began not with a crime witnessed in daylight, but with the discovery of something locked away. The man at the center of this tale was a physician named Dr. Augustin Leroux. To the public, he was a figure of respect. His reputation stretched across the neighborhoods of the French Quarter, where he treated the wealthy in grand houses and the poor in back-alley homes with equal attention. People spoke of his calm presence, his precise way of speaking, and the confidence he carried when he placed his hands upon a patient. For a city often overwhelmed by outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera, his skills were seen as a blessing. But in 1895, when Leroux suddenly died, his passing revealed something no one expected. Hidden in his home, behind a heavy oak door, stood a cabinet. Its brass handles were tarnished, its wood dark and scarred by years of use. The cabinet was locked tight, and even his closest colleagues admitted they had never seen inside. When the key was finally found among his belongings, it opened to a collection so disturbing that it would haunt the city long after his name was forgotten. Inside were bones, some whole, some fractured, and others that had been carefully cut as though for study. Jars of cloudy liquid lined the shelves, each one holding shapes that were hard to identify, but unmistakably human in nature. There were organs, preserved and floating, their surfaces pale and bloated with time. And then there were the maps. Dozens of them, spread across the bottom drawer, each one marked in red ink. Small circles dotted the streets of New Orleans, as if Leroux had been tracking certain places or certain people. The discovery spread quickly. At first, whispers passed from house to house. The doctor's cabinet, they called it. Soon, the newspapers joined in, publishing brief mentions that left more questions than answers. Was it simply a collection of medical curiosities, the kind of thing a doctor might gather to study the human body? Or was it evidence of something much? Darker murders carefully hidden under the mask of science? To understand why suspicion grew so quickly, one must remember the era. The 1890s in New Orleans were a time when medicine and superstition existed side by side. Doctors often performed autopsies in private, sometimes without family consent. Dissection of bodies was viewed with deep mistrust, especially among the poor and immigrant families who believed their loved ones might be stolen for experiments. Grave robbing, though rarely spoken of, was a known reality. And so, when the cabinet's contents were revealed, people did not easily accept it as normal medical work. Authorities moved slowly. There was no crime officially recorded. No. Missing persons connected directly to Dr. Leroux, yet the bones raised questions that could not be ignored. Some showed signs of surgical cuts, precise and clean, as if performed by a skilled hand. Others bore marks that looked more violent breaks, and fractures inconsistent with careful study. The jars, too, became a focus. Many of the organs were from children, their small sizes impossible to mistake. What explanation could there be for that? Then there were the maps. The red circles marked places across the city, from the docks along the Mississippi River to the crowded boarding houses near Basin Street. Some of the locations were hospitals and clinics, places Leroux was known to visit, but others were private homes, addresses that had no connection to medicine at all. Investigators tried to trace them, but records were incomplete, and many families had long since moved away. To this day, no one has been able to fully explain what the maps meant. The deeper people looked into Leroux's past, the more unsettling details emerged. He had never married, never kept close friends, and often disappeared for days without explanation. His neighbors recalled strange odors that sometimes drifted from his home late at night, the sour chemical smell of formaldehyde, and burnt flesh. A local undertaker admitted he had sold LaRue unclaimed bodies on more than one occasion, but the number did not match the sheer quantity of remains found in the cabinet. What terrified people most was the possibility that the bones and organs did not come from the dead, but from the living. There were rumors of patients who had gone to LaRue for treatment and never returned. At the time, it was easy to explain such disappearances as illness, poverty, or migration. But with the cabinet now revealed, the question became impossible to ignore. Had those patients ended up inside his jars? The city grew restless. The French Quarter, with its narrow streets and flickering gas lamps, seemed darker in the weeks after the discovery. Families locked their doors earlier. Children were warned not to linger near strangers. And though Dr. LaRue was already buried, his shadow seemed to linger everywhere, pressing down on the city like a fog that refused to lift. New Orleans was no stranger to strange tales. Ghosts, curses, and voodoo rituals were woven into its history, often blurring the line between legend and truth. But this was different. This was not a ghost story whispered around a fire. It was something found in a locked cabinet, something physical, undeniable, and terrifying. The coroner of Orleans Parish was ordered to examine the contents. His report was cautious, offering no bold claims, but the details only deepened the mystery. The bones belonged to men, women, and children of various ages. The organs had been preserved with skill, using fluids consistent with medical practice of the time. And yet, the sheer number, far more than any doctor would ever need for study, could not be explained. Speculation ran wild. Some believed LaRue had been conducting secret experiments, attempting to unlock the mysteries of life and death. Others whispered he was obsessed with resurrection, trying to reassemble bodies from the parts of many. The most chilling theory of all was the simplest, that he had been a murderer, hiding his crimes behind the respected mask of a physician. In the end, no one was ever charged. A cabinet was sealed away as evidence, but in time it disappeared. Its contents scattered, its maps lost. To this day, no one knows where they went, but the story of Dr. Augustin Leroux did not fade. It lingered in the city's memory, whispered in bars and repeated in hushed tones whenever talk turned to the strange and unexplained. For even in a city as haunted as New Orleans, the mystery of the doctor's cabinet stood apart, a puzzle. With no solution, a crime with no clear victim, and a fear that perhaps the truth was worse than anyone dared admit. And so it begins. The story of the doctor, the cabinet, and the secrets locked within. A story of science, death, and the possibility that in the shadows of a respectable man's home, something unspeakable once lived. The cabinet was not the end of the mystery. In fact, it was only the beginning. When Dr. Augustin Leroux was laid to rest in St. Louis Cemetery, no one, the people of New Orleans, believed they had buried the man and his secrets. But in truth, earth covered only his body. His cabinet remained, and with it, a trail of questions that refused to die. After the discovery, the authorities were forced to search his home. The house was a tall, narrow structure on a quiet street, its shutters always drawn. Neighbors admitted they rarely saw visitors, and when they did, it was often under cover of night. Stepping inside, investigators found a world that felt frozen in time. Dust coated the tables, medical texts lay stacked on every surface, and strange sketches filled his journals. The drawings were not of ordinary anatomy. Some depicted bones arranged in unnatural ways, spines curved backward, and limbs stitched together at odd angles. Others showed organs connected with lines of ink, as if LaRue were mapping out functions that had no basis in known medicine. These images suggested a mind that had wandered far from traditional practice, into something more experimental, more dangerous. Even more troubling was the basement. The house smelled strongly of chemicals, the acrid sting of preservation fluids, clinging to the air. Wooden tables bore deep stains that could not easily be explained away. Buckets, knives, and surgical saws lay neatly arranged, too many to belong to an ordinary doctor's practice. Some of the tools were modified, sharpened in unusual ways, as if designed for tasks beyond routine surgery. And then there were the ledgers. Bound in cracked leather, they listed names, dates, and notes written in Leroux's precise hand. Some entries were clear enough, mentioning patients treated for fever, cough, or broken bones. But scattered throughout were names that appeared only once, with no notes about recovery or follow-up care. These names stopped abruptly, as if the lives behind them had ended with the stroke of his pen. What made the ledgers more disturbing was how many of those names did not appear in city records. It was as though Leroux had recorded people who officially never existed. Who were they? Transients? Immigrants with no family? Or were they victims who had been erased, their identities consumed by the walls of his house? The maps, too, were revisited. Spread out across the dining room table, the red circles seemed more deliberate than ever. Some aligned with known hospitals, but others pointed to places where disappearances had been whispered about over the years. A sailor gone missing after docking in the French Quarter. A laundress who never returned home. A child who vanished on her way to school. None of these cases were ever solved, but the red ink suggested that Leroux had marked them for reasons no one could understand. Whispers spread through the French Quarter like wildfire. Families began digging through their own histories, searching for relatives who had vanished. Soon, a pattern emerged. Many of the missing belonged to groups society paid little attention to. Poor immigrants, black families, children of prostitutes, workers from the docks. People who could vanish without the city pausing to take notice. This was what frightened the community most, that Leroux's reputation as a respected doctor had given him access to the most vulnerable. He was trusted to heal, but what if he had used that trust to harvest, to turn human life into material for his private experiments? Of course, not everyone believed it. Some defended him, arguing that any physician of his time might collect specimens to advance knowledge. It was true that medical schools across the country were desperate for cadavers, and doctors often resorted to questionable methods to obtain them. Could Leroux simply have been another man caught in the dark necessities of 19th century medicine? But then came the testimony of one man that shifted the narrative entirely. A gravedigger named Elias Fontaine stepped forward, his voice trembling as he spoke. He claimed that Leroux had approached him years earlier, offering money for bodies freshly buried. At first, it was only the unclaimed dead paupers, the forgotten, those without family. But Fontaine swore that over time, Leroux became more demanding. He wanted bodies of the young, the strong, the recently deceased. Fontaine refused, frightened by the intensity in the doctor's eyes. But he admitted he had already delivered more than a dozen corpses before cutting ties. If Fontaine told the truth, then Leroux's collection was not just the product of chance. It was deliberate, organized, and funded by a man willing to pay any price for the materials he wanted. Still, even that explanation did not account for everything. The bones in the cabinet included fractures and cuts that suggested violence, not exhumation. The organs preserved in jars were not simply curiosities. They looked like they had been removed with a purpose, arranged as if for comparison or assembly. And the drawings, those haunting sketches of altered bodies, suggested Leroux was not content to study what already existed. He wanted to create something new. The newspapers seized on this angle, filling their columns with speculation. Headlines spoke of the doctor who played with death and the Cabinet of Horrors. Though the city officials tried to keep details quiet, the damage was done. Leroux's name became synonymous with dread, his legacy forever twisted in two. Suspicion. But what no one could answer was the most terrifying question of all. Why? If Leroux had been a killer, what drove him? Was it science, obsession, or madness? Was he searching for the key to eternal life, or had he simply descended into cruelty under the mask of medicine? Those who studied his journals believed they contained a clue. Among the pages of sketches and notes were repeated references to continuity. The word appeared again and again, scribbled in margins, underlined in red. He seemed to believe. The body was not a collection of separate organs, but a system that could be broken and reassembled. If that was his theory, then perhaps his experiments were attempts to prove it by creating continuity where it did not belong. And so the cabinet became more than just a container of horrors. It became a symbol of a deeper fear, a question that lingered long after his death. How far can human curiosity go before it becomes something monstrous? For New Orleans, the mystery never fully closed. Families continued to whisper about missing children. Sailors avoided certain streets. And the old Leroux house, with its shuttered windows and basement reeking of chemicals, stood as a silent reminder of what had been found. Some swore that late at night, they could still see a faint glow from the basement windows, as if the experiments continued without the man who began them. Whether truth or legend, one thing remained certain. The cabinet was real, its contents undeniable. And the more people tried to explain it, the discovery of Dr. Leroux's cabinet left the city unsettled. But the unease deepened when questions turned from what was found to where it came from. The maps, the bones, the jars, they were not isolated curiosities. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, one that seemed to point outward, into the streets and neighborhoods of New Orleans itself. Investigators tried to trace the red circles that Leroux had drawn on his maps. At first, the effort was slow, but as more people came forward with stories of missing relatives, the weight of the evidence grew heavier. Many of the marked addresses were connected to disappearances no one had ever solved. Families who had once accepted their losses as misfortune began to question if their loved ones had been caught in Leroux's orbit. One family, in particular, drew attention. The Devereaux, immigrants from France, had reported their eldest daughter missing in 1889. She had left for work at a dressmaker's shop one morning and never arrived. The police at the time dismissed it as a runaway case, suggesting she had fled to escape poverty. But now, investigators noticed that her home address was circled in Leroux's red ink. The realization chilled the Devereaux family, and they began to wonder if their daughter's fate had not been escape, but dissection. Other cases followed. A dock worker named Miguel, last seen drinking near Basin Street. A washerwoman named Eliza, who vanished while delivering laundry to a wealthy home. Even a young boy named Thomas, reported missing by his mother after a visit to the doctor. None of these cases had ever been solved, but the circles on Leroux's maps suggested they were not forgotten by him. The possibility that a respected physician had preyed upon the living caused panic to spread across the city. Churches filled with fearful families. Priests preached sermons about the dangers of trusting man over God. Mothers clutched their children more tightly, and men who once greeted doctors with gratitude now looked upon them with suspicion. But the investigation faced limits. Without bodies to match the names, and without proof of murder, authorities hesitated to declare Leroux guilty. Science in the 1890s was both revered and mistrusted, and many officials feared the scandal would undermine public faith in medicine itself. To accuse a physician of murder without undeniable proof could spark chaos, and so the matter was left in uneasy silence. Yet silence did not ease the fear. In the taverns of the French Quarter, whispers grew darker. Some said Leroux had been part of a secret society, a hidden network of men who used the poor as material for experiments. Others claimed he was influenced by voodoo practices, blending medicine with forbidden rituals to trap souls within jars. These tales blurred fact and myth, but each one added fuel to the fire. There was also the troubling matter of Leroux's final days. Neighbors recalled that in the weeks before his death, he had grown pale and restless. At night, strange noises echoed from his home scraping, hammering, and what some swore were muffled cries. One neighbor, a seamstress who lived across the street, told friends she once saw Leroux dragging a heavy sack into his basement under the cover of darkness. She had dismissed it at the time, but after the discovery of the cabinet, the image haunted her. The coroner's report on Leroux's death offered little clarity. He had collapsed suddenly, his heart failing without warning. Some speculated it was natural illness, while others believed it was the weight of guilt, or perhaps even poison. Rumors spread that someone had silenced him before he could reveal the full truth. If Leroux had been part of something larger, then his death may have been no accident. But without evidence, such ideas remained only speculation. Still, they added, another layer to the mystery. Was Leroux the mastermind of the horrors found in his cabinet, or merely a servant of forces greater than himself? The house itself became an object of fascination. Children dared each other to step onto its porch, whispering that the spirits of Leroux's victims lingered inside. Adults avoided it altogether, crossing the street rather than walk past its shuttered windows. Over time, the house earned a reputation as cursed, a place where the air was heavy with death. The few who ventured inside after the investigation described an atmosphere that could not be explained by dust and chemicals alone. They spoke of an oppressive silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Some claimed they heard faint scratching from the walls, others that they smelled decay long after the remains had been removed. Whether imagination or something more, the Leroux house became a focal point for fear, a physical reminder of what the city could not understand. And yet, despite all the suspicion, there were those who continued to defend him. Fellow physicians argued that his collection, however unsettling, was no different from the anatomical museums found in Europe. They insisted that progress in medicine often demanded uncomfortable sacrifices. To them, Leroux was not a monster, but a man ahead of his time, misunderstood by a public too afraid to accept the realities of science. This defense, however, rang hollow to the families who had lost loved ones. For them, the cabinet was proof. Enough. They saw not the advancement of medicine, but the violation of trust, the exploitation of the vulnerable. To them, Leroux was no healer. He was a predator in a doctor's coat. As the years passed, the story did not fade. Instead, it took root in the folklore of New Orleans. Parents told their children to beware of doctors who promised too much. Sailors carried the tale to distant ports, spreading Leroux's name beyond the city. Tourists who visited the French Quarter years later would hear whispers of the doctor and his cursed cabinet, their guides lowering their voices as if speaking too loudly might wake the horrors again. And somewhere beneath the weight of rumor and myth, the truth remained buried. The bones, the jars, the maps, all real, all undeniable, but their meaning still out of reach. Was Leroux truly a murderer? Was he an obsessed scientist who lost sight of humanity in his quest for knowledge? Or was he simply the unlucky keeper of secrets larger than himself, a man who stumbled into shadows he could not escape? No one could say for certain. But the city knew one thing. The mystery of the doctor's cabinet was not finished. It had only begun to open, and whatever lay inside it was darker than anyone wished to admit. As the years turned, the mystery of Dr. Leroux's cabinet did not fade from memory. It deepened, like a wound that refused to close. The city of New Orleans carried the weight of unanswered questions, and every new whisper, every rumor, seemed to drag the story further into darkness. It was not long before the cabinet itself became an object of fascination among collectors, journalists, and those who dealt in the macabre. After the official investigation ended, the contents were supposedly sealed and stored as evidence. But records showed gaps, boxes missing from the archives, jars never logged properly, maps quietly disappearing. By the turn of the century, the cabinet was no longer in the possession of the city. Some believed it had been sold secretly to a private collector, while others thought it had been destroyed to bury the scandal. Yet in the shadows of the French Quarter, whispers said the cabinet had not been lost at all. It had simply changed hands. Strange stories soon surfaced. A wealthy businessman was rumored to have purchased several of the jars at a hidden auction. His home, people said, grew cursed after their arrival. Servants claimed to hear crying from locked closets, and one maid swore she saw a small, pale hand press against the glass of a jar before vanishing into the murk. Within a year, the businessman fell ill and died suddenly, his body covered in unexplained bruises. His family fled the city, abandoning the house to rot. Other fragments of the collection appeared in odd places. A skull, said to be from Laroux's cabinet, was discovered in the possession of a traveling carnival that toured the Gulf Coast. Patrons reported that its eye sockets seemed too deep, too watchful, and that children fainted when they looked into them. A preserved heart, supposedly labeled with one of Laroux's red ink notes, surfaced decades later in the back room of a curiosity shop where the owner refused to keep it on display. Each object carried with it not just the stain of death, but a sense of something unresolved, as though the dead had not been allowed their rest. And always, the maps remained the most haunting mystery of all. At least one of them resurfaced, though how it escaped official custody was never explained. It came into the possession of a young journalist in 1903 who believed it could uncover the truth about Laroux's victims. The map was filled with red circles, as others had been, but some marks carried notes beside them, strange symbols or initials no one could decipher. The journalist followed the trail through New Orleans, visiting the addresses that had been marked. At some, he found only empty lots. At others, he uncovered stories of disappearances long forgotten. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous his search became. Neighbors warned him to stop. One old woman, clutching a rosary, told him he was stirring up the doctor's spirits, and that Leroux would not let his secrets be revealed. But the journalist pressed on, convinced he was close to discovering something that had eluded investigators years before. Then, without warning, he vanished. His notebook was found in a cafe near Canal Street, his handwriting trailing off mid-sentence. His body was never recovered. Some said he had uncovered too much, others that he had fallen victim to the same forces that had claimed Leroux's supposed victims. Whatever the truth, his disappearance only added another layer to the legend of the doctor's cabinet. The city grew accustomed to carrying the weight of the story. Tour guides told versions of it to visitors, embellishing details with each retelling. Some claimed the cabinet had contained dozens of children's skeletons. Others said Leroux had attempted to build a body from mismatched parts. Historians argued over what was fact and what was myth, but the line blurred so thoroughly that even the most careful research could not untangle it. What is certain is that New Orleans at the end of the 19th century was a city already steeped in death. Disease swept through its streets in waves. The cemeteries overflowed with the dead, their tombs stacked high to save space in the swampy ground. Ghost stories thrived in such a place, and Leroux's cabinet fit perfectly into the city's culture of shadows. But unlike the tales of spirits and curses, this one had evidence, bones, organs, maps, and journals that could not be explained away as imagination. Some believed Leroux had been searching for the secret of life itself, chasing the idea of resurrection in a city that already believed the dead never truly left. His journals hinted at experiments in continuity, in reassembling the human body like a puzzle. If this was his purpose, then the cabinet was not merely a collection, but the remains of countless failed attempts. Others were convinced he had been part of something larger, a hidden network of doctors and scientists across the South who traded in bodies and knowledge outside the reach of law. If so, then the cabinet was only a fragment of a much darker enterprise. Perhaps LaRue's sudden death had not been natural at all, but punishment for drawing too much attention. But the most terrifying theory was also the simplest, that LaRue had killed not for science, not for knowledge, but because he could. That behind his calm, respected exterior lived a hunger no one had suspected, a desire to control life and death with his own hands. If this were true, then the cabinet was not a laboratory. It was a trophy case dot as the decades passed. The house where LaRue lived fell into ruin. Windows shattered, weeds crept up through the cracks in the walls, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. But those who dared step inside claimed the air still carried the sharp tang of chemicals, as though the doctor's presence lingered. Some swore they saw shadows moving across the rooms, long after the sun had set. Others spoke of hearing faint weeping from beneath the floorboards dot by the early 20th century. The story of Dr. Augustin LaRue had become more than history. It had become legend, a tale of science twisted into horror, of a man who blurred the line between healer and killer. The truth remained locked in the past, sealed away with the missing cabinet, the lost journals, and the unanswered cries of those whose names had vanished into his ledgers. But legends, like wounds, do not heal easily. They spread, they fester, they grow darker with time. And in New Orleans, a city that thrives on stories of the dead, the legend of the doctor's cabinet became one of the darkest of all. It left behind not just fear, but a warning that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those whispered about in folklore, but those who walk among us in daylight, wearing the face of respectability, hiding their secrets behind locked doors. The cabinet's secrets refused to remain silent. For weeks after its discovery, rumors rippled through New Orleans like a fever. Some swore the bones were those of patients who had trusted the doctor. Others claimed they were stolen from graveyards in the dead of night. And yet, nothing seemed to fit neatly into a single explanation. The evidence was too bizarre, too deliberate, too carefully arranged. The jars of liquid drew the most attention. They weren't labeled with ordinary terms, but with strange symbols. One had a triangle drawn in black ink across the glass. Another bore the outline of a hand with a missing finger. Each seemed to mark its contents in a way that was not meant for common understanding. Inside the murky fluids were fragments of tissue, sometimes unrecognizable, sometimes disturbingly clear. A preserved tongue, a shriveled piece of skin. Tiny bones, perhaps from a child, floating like broken feathers. The red-marked maps told a different story. Spread across the region of Louisiana, small towns and swamps were circled, each accompanied by a date. Some dated back more than 10 years, others far more recent. It suggested movement, a pattern of travel, but the purpose was impossible to guess. Why would a physician keep such records? And why mark them in blood-red ink, as though they were warnings or reminders of something terrible? Authorities tried to handle the case quietly. The city was proud of its doctors, proud of its hospitals, and growing reputation as a place of progress. To expose one of their own as a criminal would damage trust. And so, the cabinet was locked away in a back office, studied only by a handful of men sworn to silence. But silence is fragile. Within weeks, whispers reached the press, and soon the doctor's cabinet became a phrase spoken in fear. Neighbors came forward with stories that seemed harmless at first, but grew darker upon reflection. They remembered late-night visitors, to the physician's home people who never seemed to be seen again. They remembered strange smells drifting from the doctor's rooms, the sickly sweet odor of decay masked with heavy perfumes. One neighbor swore she saw him carrying something wrapped in a stained sheet down to the river at midnight. At the time, she thought it was nothing more than discarded medical waste. Now she was no longer certain. The doctor's personal life offered no comfort. He had been a solitary man, rarely seen with friends or family. His patients described him as polite but distant, always more interested in their bodies than their words. He asked unusual questions about dreams, about fears, about memories that seemed unrelated to illness. Some found it curious, others unnerving. One former patient confessed that she had never felt like she was being healed, but rather studied, as though she were part of some hidden experiment. A darker theory began to spread. Perhaps the doctor had been searching for something beyond medicine. Perhaps he had been probing the line between life and death, between body and spirit. The jars, the bones, the maps, were they the artifacts of research? Or were they trophies, each one tied to a victim who never returned home? Church leaders denounced the physician as a sinner, declaring the cabinet proof of his pact with unholy forces. Priests spoke of forbidden knowledge, of science corrupted into sorcery. They warned that the items in the cabinet were cursed, that the very air around them carried a shadow of evil. Meanwhile, scholars in the city argued the opposite, that the doctor was ahead of his time, conducting studies too bold for his era. To them, the horror lay not in murder, but in misunderstood genius. The truth remained buried in silence, hidden beneath speculation and fear. But one thing was certain. The cabinet had not appeared overnight. It had been built piece by piece, item by item, over years, which meant there was a trail, a history waiting to be uncovered. Somewhere in that trail lay the answer, whether the doctor had been a healer, a murderer, or something far stranger. For the investigators, the question was no longer simply what the doctor had done. It was how far he had gone. And more unsettling, still had his work ended with his death? Or was it still unfolding, carried forward by hands unknown? As the city grew restless, the cabinet sat locked in its silent room, waiting. Every man who entered felt the same unease, as though the doctor's presence lingered in the air. The jars seemed to tremble in the dim light. The maps seemed to breathe with hidden meaning. It was no longer just a collection of objects. It was a story, a dark one that had yet to be fully told, and like all stories born in shadows, it would demand its truth, one way or another. The locked cabinet had become more than an object of curiosity. It was now a looming question mark hanging over the entire city. Whispers spread through New Orleans like wildfire, from the grand parlors of the wealthy to the dim back rooms of the French Quarter taverns. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What kind of physician left behind such grotesque artifacts, and why had he guarded them with such secrecy? The police, still cautious, continued their investigation into the late doctor's affairs. But the more they searched, the less they seemed to find. His home was spacious, but oddly sterile, as if he had deliberately hidden traces of his personal life. No family photographs, no letters, no keepsakes from friends-only medical texts, glass instruments, and cabinets full of powders, roots, and tinctures. It was the home of a man consumed by his work. Yet even in that cold atmosphere, the locked cabinet stood apart, radiating menace. By now, the authorities had made a shocking decision. They would open it. A blacksmith was summoned to the residence one humid morning. He worked steadily at the cabinet's lock, while detectives stood silently around him, their nerves evident. The air seemed heavier, and even the light filtering through the shutters felt dimmer. When the iron lock finally gave way with a shrill snap, A silence fell across the room. Slowly, the cabinet door was pried open, and its secrets spilled into view. Inside were rows of shelves stacked with strange objects. Jars filled with cloudy liquid glistened in the low light. Some contained what looked like preserved organs, their shapes distorted but recognizable. Bones were piled neatly in wooden boxes, tagged with small scraps of paper. And there, carefully folded on the top shelf, were maps of New Orleans marked with tiny red crosses. Each cross was drawn near a parish, a hospital, or in certain cases, the shadowy corners of alleyways. The detectives recoiled. What was this collection? Was it evidence of a physician's obsession with study, or proof of something far darker? Word of the cabinet's contents leaked quickly into the city. Some newspapers painted it as the curiosity of a brilliant man who had sought to understand death in order to prevent it. Others suggested something more sinister, that the physician had experimented on the living as well as the dead. Soon after, rumors of missing patients began to resurface. People remembered stories of loved ones who had entered the doctor's care and never returned. In most cases, the explanations had been vague patients transferred, moved to another facility, or said to have died quietly. But the families had never seen the bodies, never been given records, and never received closure. Now those absences took on a chilling new meaning. The maps became the most disturbing clue. Each red mark could represent a site where the doctor conducted his grim work. Some aligned with known cemeteries and hospitals, but others were traced to isolated places where the poor and the forgotten often vanished without questions. Asked, the city was beginning to wonder if this respected physician had been far more than a healer. Authorities wrestled with how to present their findings. To admit the truth outright risked panic, yet to hide it meant covering up what could be a monstrous crime. Newspapers, sensing the drama, did not wait for official statements. Headlines screamed about the doctor's cabinet of horrors, fueling speculation and fear. As the public demanded answers, the police launched a search for more evidence. They combed through medical records, interviewed surviving patients, and tracked down anyone who had known the doctor well. But here, too, mystery grew. It seemed the man had lived a double life, carefully presenting one face to society while concealing another. Colleagues remembered him as quiet, diligent, even generous with his time. Yet none could explain why he had kept human remains in his home, or why he had marked his maps with such unsettling precision. Even more troubling was the handwriting on the scraps of paper attached to the bones. Each was marked with dates, initials, or fragments of words. Some looked like medical notes, others resembled cryptic codes. Experts examined them, but could not decipher their true meaning. Was it a catalog of patients, a record of victims, or something else entirely? The deeper the investigators dug, the darker the story seemed to become. And as they sifted through the physician's life, one thing became increasingly clear. His secrets had not died with him. They were still very much alive, lingering in the bones and the maps, whispering from the shelves of the cabinet he had guarded so fiercely. The question was no longer simply what he had done, but how far he had gone. The city of New Orleans had seen its share of scandal, but the whispers surrounding Dr. Henry Whitlock now felt heavier, more sinister. The local newspapers began printing small, cautious articles that hinted at odd discoveries in the doctor's home, though no one dared speak the full truth. Editors feared lawsuits or backlash from the city's wealthy medical institutions. Still, the rumors spread like wildfire, carried in hushed conversations in taverns, markets, and on street corners. Bones in a cabinet, maps with red, ink stains, strange jars filled with things not meant to be seen. For the ordinary people of the French Quarter, it was enough to spark fear. For the elite, it was enough to spark outrage. They wanted the matter buried quickly. A scandal of this size could stain the reputation of the entire city. But the more the powerful tried to silence the matter, the louder it seemed to grow. Detective Lucien Marlowe was caught in the middle. He wanted answers, yet he faced increasing pressure to leave the matter alone. The more he pushed, the more resistance he encountered. Officials hinted that his career could end abruptly if he continued. But Lucien had already gone too far. He could not stop now, not when so much remained unanswered. One evening, he sat alone in his small office, staring at the documents spread before him. The coroner's reports, the doctor's notes, and the half-burned letters formed a puzzle that refused to fit together. The bones in the cabinet, according to early examination, were from more than one person. Some were female, some were male. The ages varied. Yet none of these individuals had been officially reported as missing in the city. This detail gnawed at Lucien's thoughts. If these people had not been reported missing, who were they? Street dwellers? Orphans? Immigrants with no family ties? The thought made Lucien's stomach turn. In a city as bustling and chaotic as New Orleans, it was easy for the forgotten to vanish. And perhaps that made them perfect subjects for a man with dark intentions. The maps presented an even stranger mystery. Each one was marked with red ink, circles surrounding areas near the swamps, the river, and even the outskirts of the cemeteries. Some circles overlapped, as though the doctor had returned to the same places more than once. To the untrained eye, the marks could be dismissed as medical routes or survey notes. But to Lucien, they looked like hunting grounds. He decided he had to follow them. The next morning, Lucien took a lantern and a small satchel and set off toward one of the locations marked on the maps. It was a stretch of swamp near Bayou St. John, a place locals avoided after dark. By day, it was a tangle of reeds, insects, and the heavy smell of damp earth. By night, it was a theater of shadows, where the croak of frogs and the distant call of birds echoed through the stillness. Lucien trudged through the muck, his boots sinking into the wet ground. Mosquitoes swarmed around him, and the humid air clung to his skin. He pressed forward, guided by the markings on the map. After nearly an hour of searching, he stumbled upon something half buried near a rotting log. His lantern's light flickered. Over a fragment of bone, he crouched and brushed away the dirt. The shape was unmistakable, a human jawbone, still with 2 teeth intact. Lucien's chest tightened. He searched the surrounding ground and soon uncovered more remains, scattered and broken, as though tossed without care. The swamp had swallowed them, but not completely. He marked the location and returned to the city at dawn, exhausted but burning with determination. He now had proof that the maps were not just idle notes. They were records. Records of places where human remains had been left behind. Yet still, the question remained. Why? That evening, Lucien revisited the doctor's journal. He turned past the usual clinical notes until he found another passage written in the doctor's frantic, almost feverish hand. The essence of vitality lies not in the flesh, but in the current that flows beneath. It must be harnessed, measured, extracted. Only through the persistence of study will the threshold be crossed. And when it is, death itself shall bow. The words chilled him. They were not the words of a healer. They were the words of a man. Consumed by obsession, a man who believed he could master life and death. Lucien thought of the jars filled with fluids, of bones stored like trophies, and of maps leading to shallow graves. If Henry Whitlock had been conducting experiments, then he had crossed every moral boundary. He had used human beings not as patients, but as tools. But one piece of the puzzle still haunted Lucien, the locked drawer he had not yet managed to open. He had pried open the cabinet, sifted through the papers, but the drawer in the doctor's study remained sealed. He believed that inside it lay the true answers, perhaps even names or records of those who had been taken. Late that night, Lucien returned to the doctor's home once more. The house was still and silent, cloaked in dust and shadow. He carried with him a small iron tool, intent on forcing the drawer open. The study smelled of stale smoke and mildew. He set to work, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. After several tense minutes, the lock gave way with a sharp snap. Lucien opened the drawer slowly, almost afraid of what he would find. Inside was a collection of small, leather-bound notebooks. Each was numbered and dated. He opened the first. The entries were meticulous, written in the same obsessive hand. Subject 1. Male. Approx. Age 40. Strong constitution. Resistance to tincture minimal. Extracted fluids preserved. Lucien's breath caught. He flipped to the next page. Subject 2. Female. Approx. Age 25. Rapid deterioration after incision. Specimen incomplete. Further trials required. On. And on the notes went. Subject after subject, described clinically, as though they were nothing more than objects in an experiment. Dates stretched back nearly a decade. Lucien closed the book with shaking hands. There was no longer any doubt. Dr. Henry Whitlock had not merely studied medicine. He had hunted, taken, and experimented on the forgotten souls of the city. As Lucien set the notebooks back in the drawer, he noticed something else tucked in the corner. A small envelope, sealed with black wax. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. It contained a single phrase, written in uneven, hurried strokes. They watch me still. Even in death, I am not alone. Lucien stared at the words, unease creeping through him. Who was watching the doctor? Was it paranoia? Or had Henry Whitlock uncovered something that reached beyond science, something darker than even Lucien had imagined? The detective sat in the silence of the study, the notebook heavy in his hands, the envelope resting before him. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he felt something deeper than suspicion. He felt dread. The locked cabinet was no longer a curiosity. It had become a living presence in the minds of everyone who heard about it. Word spread quietly through New Orleans like smoke, curling into the alleys, slipping into the French Quarter's taverns, and even finding its way into the parlors of the city's most respected families. Everyone wanted to know what it meant, but few were brave enough to ask too many questions, afraid of where the answers might lead. The doctor's reputation was already shifting. Only a year before, he had been spoken of with reverence, an innovator, a healer, a man whose hands could save the dying. But now, his name came with a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might invite his ghost into the room. The man with the cabinet, they said, and then fell silent. Henry, the young journalist, had never been more restless. He spent his days in archives and nights walking the streets, piecing together fragments of the physician's past. The more he searched, the stranger the picture became. The doctor had not always been in New Orleans. Before arriving in the city, he had practiced in Georgia, and before that, in Virginia. Each time he moved, he left behind whispers of strange experiments, patients who never recovered, bodies quietly buried, and a trail of unanswered questions. But none of those towns had uncovered a cabinet. New Orleans was different. Here, the physician seemed to have grown bolder, as if he felt untouchable. The collection inside the cabinet, bones, jars, and maps, felt less like an accident, and more like the careful design of a man who no longer feared exposure. The maps began to trouble Henry most of all. He laid them across his desk, tracing the red ink markings that dotted the city. At first, they seemed random, an abandoned building here, a swamp edge there, and a warehouse by the docks. But then he noticed the pattern. Each place marked with ink was a location tied to unsolved disappearances. A dock worker gone missing, a young seamstress who never came home, A sailor whose body was never recovered from the river. The cabinet was not just a storage chest. It was a record. A ledger of crimes hidden beneath the disguise of medical science. One night, Henry visited one of the marked places himself. It was an old warehouse near the Mississippi River, its windows broken, its walls leaning against the shoe. Damp. Inside, he found nothing but shadows and silence. Yet the air carried a heaviness, as if it remembered what had happened there. Scratches along the floorboards suggested crates had once been dragged across it. The faint outline of a dark stain clung to the wood, almost invisible unless one bent close. He returned shaken, but more determined. The physician had used New Orleans as a hunting ground. Each map point was a destination where his work had been carried out. The jars and bones in the cabinet were trophies, pieces of his victims preserved in silence. But Henry was not the only one searching. There were others, men with darker motives, who saw the cabinet as more than just evidence. In certain circles, whispers began to rise about its potential value. Collectors of the bizarre, men who dealt in black market curiosities, spoke of it like a holy relic. Human bones marked by science or ritual were worth fortunes to the right buyer. Soon, Henry noticed he was being followed. A tall figure lingered outside his boarding house. A carriage trailed him as he walked through the quarter. Someone else wanted the cabinet, and they were willing to make sure he never told the story first. Inside the city, tension grew. Families whispered about missing loved ones. The police, who had once dismissed the doctor as an eccentric, began to feel the weight of public suspicion. Yet even they hesitated. To accuse a respected man even in death was to risk the reputation of the city itself. New Orleans had always walked a line between beauty and decay, but this revelation threatened to tear the mask away completely. Henry pressed forward, writing drafts of his story by candlelight, though he dared not publish them yet. He feared the cabinet might vanish before he could finish, stolen away by collectors or destroyed by those who wanted the truth, buried. Late one evening, a knock came at his door. When he opened it, no one stood there, only a parcel, neatly wrapped, lying on the step. Inside, he found a single jar, cloudy with age, filled with yellowing liquid. Floating within was something small and shriveled, a human finger, pale and unrecognizable. No note, no explanation. Just the jar, delivered like a warning. Henry realized the cabinet was no longer just a story he was chasing. It was chasing him back. The physician's shadow had stretched beyond death, binding itself to anyone who dared disturb his secrets. The cabinet was not merely a collection of objects. It was a curse, drawing in the curious, the greedy, and the fearful alike. And Henry, for better or worse, had stepped too close to its pull. The question was no longer what the doctor had done. The real question was how far the darkness would spread before someone was willing to stop it. The news of Dr. Armand's hidden experiments spread like a fever across New Orleans. Newspapers hinted at the scandal, though most avoided printing details too grotesque for the public eye. Still, whispers filled the streets, traveling from dock workers to market stalls, from church pews to gambling halls. People spoke of the bones in jars and maps written in blood, as if repeating the details gave them some protection against the horror. Inside the doctor's house, the investigation deepened. Detectives searched every room, pulling out books, records, and strange medical sketches. Some were harmless, a physician's notes on diseases of the heart or lungs. But tucked among them were drawings of human bodies, cut open in unnatural ways, the muscles and veins mapped out with obsessive precision. Each page felt less like science and more like something darker, a fascination that reached beyond medicine into the grotesque. The most disturbing discoveries, however, came from the cabinet. Behind a false back panel, investigators found more hidden jars, Some contained murky liquids that gave off a smell so sour it burned the eyes. Floating inside were small shapes organs, unidentifiable, suspended in cloudy preservation. One jar, larger than the rest, contained something that turned every stomach in the room. The shriveled remains of a hand, curled like it had died mid-grasp. The maps marked in red ink were studied more closely. They weren't simply drawings of the city. Certain areas were circled with precision, abandoned warehouses along the river, back alleys in the French Quarter, stretches of swamp on the city's outskirts. No explanation was written, but each location matched police records of people gone missing. Sailors who vanished after a night of drinking, women who never returned home from work, children who slipped into the shadows and were never seen again. The possibility could no longer be ignored. Dr. Armand's cabinet wasn't a quirk of eccentric science. It was evidence of a hidden campaign of experiments, perhaps killings, carried out in the silence of night. But why? What was he trying to prove? Some investigators believed the doctor was attempting to advance medical knowledge, pushing into forbidden areas others feared to study. Others whispered that he had become addicted to the act of dissection itself, no longer caring whether his subjects were living people stolen from the streets. The most chilling theory came from a police surgeon who studied the cabinet carefully. Armand might have been searching for a way to alter the human body itself, testing methods that could push life beyond its natural limits. As these dark suspicions grew, the city's atmosphere thickened with unease. Rumors of grave robbing resurfaced, with mourners visiting cemeteries to ensure their loved ones still rested beneath the soil. Families who had once praised the doctor's reputation now looked back on every visit to his clinic with dread, wondering what had really been happening behind closed doors. The community's fear turned quickly to anger. Crowds gathered outside the doctor's home, demanding answers from the authorities. The police tried to hold them back, but the voices grew louder with each passing day. Some shouted that Armand had been a murderer all along, that his wealth and influence had protected him from suspicion. Others claimed he had been part of a secret society, conducting rituals disguised as medicine. With the cabinet as his altar. Inside the precinct, detectives debated their next steps. They had evidence, yes, but no confessions, no witnesses who had seen the doctor commit a crime. Without a body that could be identified, without proof that his victims were truly murdered and not taken from graves, the law could do little. Yet the public demanded justice, and justice would not be satisfied by silence. One evening, as the investigators worked late in the doctor's study, a hidden drawer was discovered beneath the cabinet. Inside lay a bundle of papers bound in leather, brittle and yellowed with age. They appeared to be the doctor's private journal. The first pages seemed normal enough, recording treatments, symptoms, and outcomes from his patients. But soon the entries took a darker turn. He wrote of subjects that do not resist and of acquiring material in the dead of night. He described fluids injected into flesh, organs removed for observation, bones boiled clean to study there. Structure. He noted failures in calm, clinical language, subject expired after injection, or specimen decomposed too quickly to be of use. But in the final pages, his tone shifted from cold observation to something almost feverish. He wrote of reaching the threshold of discovery, of glimpsing the line between life and death, and pushing it farther with each attempt. He wrote of being haunted by whispers, shadows, and visions that came to him as he worked, guiding his hands toward new horizons. The words grew less coherent, slipping into rants about immortality, transformation, and unlocking the divine machine of man. The detectives who read those pages felt their stomachs twist. This wasn't just the record of a doctor gone astray. It was the manifesto of a man who believed himself chosen to play with life itself. Word of the journal leaked to the press, and by the next morning, all of New Orleans was consumed by the story. For the first time, the city looked back at its respected physician not as a healer, but as something monstrous. Families of the missing wept in anger, convinced their loved ones had become victims of his experiments. Religious leaders declared his work a sin against God, while skeptics argued that perhaps it was madness, a mind broken by ambition. Yet one question remained unanswered. If Dr. Armand was truly guilty of all these horrors, then where were the bodies? The bones in the jars and the strange fluids were proof of something. Yes, but not enough to match the number of disappearances tied to the red-marked map's dot. It was this question that led detectives to their next step. If the cabinet had revealed so much, perhaps the rest of the doctor's house still concealed his secrets. The basement, the attic, the very walls themselves, all became suspects in the search, and what they would find hidden beneath the house, where Armand had lived and worked for decades, would be darker than anyone in New Orleans could have imagined. By the turn of the century, the story of Dr. Armand Beaumont had moved beyond New Orleans. Newspapers in other cities picked it up, often exaggerating details, transforming him into a near-mythical figure. Some called him a mad scientist who had tried to raise the dead. Others painted him as a misunderstood genius, a man punished by a world too small-minded to appreciate his vision. Yet those who had seen his cabinet with their own eyes, those who had smelled the sickly sweetness of preserved flesh or touched the brittle fragments of bone, knew better. They carried the truth in their silence. The mansion, left abandoned after the investigations, quickly decayed. Locals said that at night the windows glowed faintly, as if a lantern still burned inside. Children dared each other to step onto the porch, to touch the heavy front door, but none ever lingered for long. The air seemed colder there, as though the walls remembered every cut of the scalpel, every secret whispered in the dark. Some claimed that if you stood at the gate too long, you could hear the faint clink of glass jars being moved, even though the cabinet had long since been emptied. But what became of the cabinet itself was a story just as strange. For years, it sat locked in a police storage room, untouched, avoided, feared. Officers assigned to that wing said they hated walking past it. Some refused to go near it altogether, claiming they heard faint knocks from inside the wood, like something trying to get out. When the department eventually cleaned out old evidence to make space, the cabinet mysteriously vanished from the records. Some whispered it had been burned, others swore a private collector had taken it. The truth was never revealed, leaving the fate of its contents a mystery just as chilling as the man who had once guarded them. Meanwhile, scattered reports continued to surface stories of strange disappearances in neighborhoods Beaumont had once worked in, of skeletons unearthed in places marked on his red-inked maps. Each discovery added a new shadow to his already dark legend. Was the physician truly experimenting for science, or had he taken pleasure in pain, collecting human remnants like trophies? The evidence pointed both ways, leaving historians divided. Even decades later, what could not be denied was the hold his story had over the imagination. Writers, artists, and storytellers began weaving their own versions of Beaumont's life. In penny dreadfuls and serialized magazines, he became a figure half monster, half genius. A few daring doctors even defended him in essays, arguing that he was on the verge of medical breakthroughs that could have changed the world. But the general public was less forgiving. To them, he remained a figure of Fear the Doctor, who locked his horrors in a cabinet, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to open it. The families of the vanished never forgot. Though many never received justice, they passed down the tale of Beaumont with bitterness, ensuring their children and grandchildren would not mistake him for a tragic hero. For them, he was not misunderstood. He was guilty. Their grief lingered like a wound that refused to heal, a reminder that beneath The surface of every city lies a darkness waiting to be uncovered. Even as the years blurred fact into legend, the name Beaumont carried a warning. His mansion crumbled, his cabinet disappeared, but the unease remained. The story traveled through whispers, campfire retellings, and hushed conversations on stormy nights. And every version, no matter how embellished, circled back to the same haunting image: a locked cabinet filled with bones, jars, and secrets too heavy for the living to bear. Was Dr. Armand Beaumont a man ahead of his time, or a killer who used science as his mask? The question still hung over New Orleans, unanswered, like the faint rattle of a key turning in a lock that should never be opened. Some mysteries fade with time. His, however, only grew darker, refusing to die, just like the shadows that still seemed to cling to the ruins of his home. The mystery of the doctor's cabinet was never solved, and perhaps it was never meant to be. The cabinet stood empty now, its shelves bare, its jars destroyed, and its secrets scattered to the winds. For years, it had been the beating heart of suspicion, a silent witness to the most sinister tale New Orleans had ever whispered. But with its destruction came no peace, only deeper uncertainty. For in its absence, the questions multiplied. Who was Dr. Armand Leckler? Was he a healer who ventured too far into the unknown, or a predator cloaked in the robes of science? The trial had ended with no decisive answers. Witnesses contradicted one another, papers vanished from the court, and the jury, frightened, confused, perhaps even bribed, could not agree. In the end, Armand Leckler was neither convicted nor cleared. His name drifted into shadow, his house abandoned, his practice closed. But his legend only grew, carried on the lips of dockworkers, priests, and beggars who swore they had seen strange lights glowing in his windows long after he was gone. The city, too, seemed to hold on to him. Some nights, when the fog rolled in, thick from the river, the air carried the sharp scent of formaldehyde, though no laboratory remained to produce it. Children dared one another to run up to the Leckler house and press their ears against the door, listening for the faint clinking of glass, as though unseen hands were still moving jars across invisible shelves. But the most unsettling discovery came years later, in 1912, when workers digging the foundations for a new building on Dauphine Street unearthed a collection of bones. They were arranged carefully, deliberately, and bound with strange copper wires. Some were human, others belonged to animals not native to Louisiana. Among the debris was a single piece of parchment, its ink faded but still legible. On it was drawn another map with the familiar red circles, and in the margin, scrawled in handwriting eerily similar to Leclerc's, were two words: not finished. The city erupted in rumor once again. Was this evidence that the doctor's experiments had continued even after his disappearance? Or was it a cruel trick planted by someone who wanted the ghost of Leckler to haunt New Orleans forever? The police buried the findings, refusing to release them to the public, but whispers spread too quickly to be silenced. As the decades passed, the legend of the doctor's cabinet transformed. Some believed it was a tale of medical genius crushed by superstition. Others swore it was proof of a man who had fed his thirst for knowledge with human lives. Ghost stories emerged, claiming that Leclerc's victims roamed the French Quarter at night, seeking their stolen bones. Sailors reported dreams of glass jars filled with eyes that floated just beneath the surface of the Mississippi. Historians, unable to separate fact from fiction, resigned themselves to calling it an unsolved case, one of the many shadows in the city's long and haunted history. Even now, when tourists walk through the old streets of New Orleans, guides tell the tale of the doctor and his cabinet. They speak of the locked doors, the bones in jars, the maps with their ominous circles. They pause in front of the lot where his house once stood, now just another building lost to time. and asked their audience to imagine what might still lie beneath the ground. For no one could ever prove that all of Leclerc's secrets had been uncovered. Perhaps the truth is buried in some forgotten archive, hidden in a box mislabeled and gathering dust. Perhaps it is still out there, waiting to be found, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to open the door again. But until then, the cabinet remains locked in the imagination, a dark riddle with no answer. And maybe that is what makes the story endure. Not the bones, not the maps, not the jars, but the silence. The silence of a city that never learned the truth about its doctor. The silence of a cabinet that guarded its horrors until the very end. In that silence, the questions echo endlessly. Was it medicine or murder? Science or sin? A man reaching for progress, or a monster feeding on the vulnerable? The city of New Orleans still doesn't know, and perhaps it never will.